The U.S. has suspended military aid to Ukraine. Is this even legal? And how exactly is this going to make peace more likely? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is more idiocy from the Trump administration, right? U.S. military aid is reportedly suspended at the Polish border, according to Donald Tusk, Polish prime minister. Now, the problem with this is severalfold. First is that Congress, not the president, decides where the money goes, and the president cannot unilaterally decide not to spend money allocated by Congress. That is just not an authority he has. It's something that the Supreme Court has held in the Impoundment Act. So it's not clear that this is even legal. That's one of the reasons why the Trump administration has used the word pause to describe this suspension of aid. But you can't really get away with that sort of thing for very long. Now, again, will this actually result in any action by a largely spineless and complacent U.S. Congress? No, of course not. Congress it's just a bunch of empty suits that exist solely to support the president or the Democratic Party, who only really roll out their ability to engage in opposition to bills that have no meaning at all. Now, here's the thing. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk called the situation an emergency and insisted on, of course, joint efforts to resolve this. This is exactly what you would expect. If the U.S. was going to withdraw from supporting Ukraine, this would be the worst possible way to do it, right? The reason is because, again, Europe has said we want to continue to do this, and we do view ourselves as your allies. So you should give us some heads up so that we can assume, fill in the gaps, so to speak, with our own effort, right? Even if this was the U.S.'s plan to say, listen, we're going to pivot to this neutral broker stance, doing so with zero notice. And I want to point out that while the actual the stupid Oval Office blow up that caused this, right, was absolutely not an insult to Trump or Vance, and they took it as an insult and ran with it. But even if the opposite were true, even if Zelensky came in there and said a bunch of crazy shit, the president, right, because a person slighted you doesn't mean that you do not want to, that it doesn't mean that you have to stop taking that stance, right? An example might be, let's say you go to a hospital. You say, man, I'm feeling really sick, or my kid's really sick. You go to a hospital and the nurse that checks you in, she says something mean to you. Maybe she implies that you should have been taking better care of your kid. Are you going to leave the hospital? No, of course not. You're going to focus on the bigger picture. And so the fact that this series of actions, which has so many unforced errors in it, again, the Europeans say, guys, we're not prepared for you to suspend this. And we're still your NATO allies. We don't want you to do this. Why are you doing this with zero notice, right? It's an unforced error. And it's a direct reflection of the fact that the president himself has said that Zelensky, I'm doing it because he made me mad. Because I felt personally slighted by this country's leader. And again, this is like taking your sick kid to a ER and then turning around and leaving because the nurse was mean and hurt your fifis. It's unbelievably thin-skinned and unbelievably short-sighted. Unless, of course, you ask Russia, who I want to point out that, okay, the official stance of the president, and let's see if we can actually find this here, right, is that the president barely has a coherent official stance. This is not me insulting him. This is me literally repeating what he himself does say. Right? That he himself has said, again, he just jumps around topics because he doesn't seem to have any sort of cohesion, right? So Zelensky said the end of the war with Russia is very, very far away. And he says this was made by Zelensky. America will not put up with this for much longer. It is what I was saying. The guy doesn't want there to be peace as long as he has America's backing. And Europe, in the meeting they had with Zelensky, said flatly they cannot do the job without the U.S. Probably not a great statement to have been made in terms of a show of strength against Russia. What are they thinking? Well, again, if you recognize that it's flawed for Europe to project weakness in front of Russia, why is it okay for the U.S. to project maximum weakness, right? And this is the sort of inability. And then Trump literally just a few hours prior said the only president who gave none of Ukraine's land to Putin's Russia is himself, right? And he says it was weak and ineffective Democrats who are criticizing him. And this is just it's incredibly sideways, because here's the thing, guys, is that think of these negotiations like this. You go to a car dealership, and in front of the car salesman, you are on a phone with your boss, and you very publicly say, if I don't leave here with a car, I'm going to lose my job. Now, you're a used car salesman. Are you going to give that guy any kind of break, any kind of deal? Why would you? In fact, given the fact that you know that person is at your car dealership and will not leave without buying a car, you will charge the maximum amount of money you legally can. And so for the United States, right, they have just said unilaterally, they've said, listen, we're going to put Zelensky in the hardest possible spot because he doesn't want peace. And one, that's easily refutable because they literally held a peace conference 6 months ago. Here, June 2024, Ukraine had a peace summit in which Russia was invited. Russia declined to participate. Does that sound like the actions of a country not interested in peace, right? And of course, Ukraine literally was like, here is the things to talk about when we do sit down with Russia. Doesn't that seem like someone who wants peace, right? Doesn't that seem like the actions of someone, of a country who is interested in peace? And he says, listen, there's issues that have to be discussed, including nuclear safety at the occupied power plants, right? Food security, the ability for Ukraine to continue to export its grains, right? Ukrainian energy infrastructure repair and restoration, POWs, civilian detainees, and child deportees, right? The actual status of the Russia-Ukraine border. Of course, Ukraine has said Russia has to withdraw from sovereign Ukrainian territory, right? A war crime investigation. Of course, ecocide, the decision by Russia to destroy a dam flooding basically the lower part of the entire city of Kherson, and security guarantees against Russian aggression, because Russia has repeatedly violated treaties. And they said, listen, Zelensky and Putin meeting will take place. This is literally Ukraine's publicly signed onto stance, right? So this is the kind of thing, right, that the reality just doesn't. How do you not? You're the president of the United States and you don't know what happened 6 months ago. It's not crazy. He does know, but he is favoring Russia. He is pro-Russian, right? And we know this because Russia is doing exactly what that car dealer would do. They are hardening their stance. You notice now Russia says they categorically will not accept European peacekeepers in Ukraine, which should be a question. He says, wow, European peacekeepers are highly questionable, to put it mildly. First, European Union is biased, while peacekeepers must be unbiased, which is not true, and which is not true on both levels. Second, Russia categorically opposes this. Now, which is not really a second point to being like, we oppose it because the European Union is biased, and we oppose it because we oppose. The second reason is we don't like it because we don't like it. Very, very cool. But this is part of a pattern of increasingly hardened stances by the Russians in response to what they perceive as weakness, right? Now, the Russians, this is literally from, let's see, this is earlier, just a few days ago in Qatar. This is from Sergei Lavrov, a transcript from the Russian government, by the way. So the official statements of the Russian foreign minister says that there can be no, right? There can be no ceasefire and introduction of peacekeeping forces, right? Then, according to Macron, Lavrov says, Macron wants to discuss territories, people, lives, and others parameters that can be withheld for later. He says this is a trick. Russia cannot possibly agree to an arrangement that is aimed at achieving a single goal, to pump Ukraine full of weapons again, right? And this is the thing. Russia is explicitly saying, we will not sign a ceasefire. We will not be signing a peace deal. We refuse to sign any kind of deal, right, that allows Ukraine to rearm, here's the question. Ukraine, up until for the first 3 years of this conflict, has at no point invaded Russia. Prior to 2022, Ukraine posed no meaningful threat to the Russian military. If Russia isn't going to continue the war after the ceasefire, why is it really important that Ukraine have no military? It's like this. Let's say your neighbor and you are in a dispute. You think your neighbor has has broken in your house and stolen something. And you go to him, you say, I'm going to call the cops, or I'm going to break into your house and I'm going to get my stuff back unless we come to an agreement. And your neighbor goes, fine, but I don't want you to ever have locks on your door. You'd go, what? He goes, yeah, those locks, those make me feel insecure. Yeah, and you go, they're locks, dude. They're in my house. They can't hurt you. This is what Russia is saying. This is why we cannot believe what Russia says. Because why is it important that you do these things? And the same argument, honestly, can be applied to NATO, because NATO is solely a defensive alliance, and that other than nuclear exchanges, Article 5 requires the agreement of all parties within NATO. And at least 2 of those parties are currently governed by very pro-Russian governments. And NATO, for the record, has never conducted offensive operations in Europe. It has not happened. They have held 0 territory in Europe. And so, what is Russia afraid of? Why would Russia be complaining about NATO membership for Ukraine when Ukraine's solely a defensive alliance? And you say, oh, well, they don't want Ukraine on their border. Well, that's not true, because there's already NATO countries on Russia's border. So what is it about Ukraine, right? Finland has a much larger economy and sits on Russia's border. Sweden has a much larger economy and more effective military and sits on Russia's border. What is it about Ukraine that so bothers them that they're going to put, again, locks on their door? That should tell you, that's a clue that Russia isn't actually interested in peace. Also, the other clue is Russia explicitly stating, we aren't interested in peace, right? And so this kind of thing, this is just bunk. This is just the president spewing nonsense. He wants to see Russia win because I think fundamentally he believes he will get paid if Russia succeeds. That's it. That's it, right? Remember, the president's first official act as president was not to do anything for the United States. It was to launch a scam coin, a scam cryptocurrency, something that his own Treasury Department has ruled had no value, was not an investment vehicle, was utterly worthless. So why then it's fair to say that I think he just thinks he's going to get paid, right? Now, before we talk about the troubling trends among, well, not just a bunch of troubling trends among not just public opinion surveys, but also the economy, right? The markets are starting to realize that this isn't the pro-business, friendly, strong administration of the first Trump administration. This is some kind of other pretty scary thing. And the markets are starting to reflect that, right? And oh boy, we're going to talk about that plus a whole bunch of other stuff here. Now, but before we do that, right, I want to mention, well, actually, I have 2 other stories that I think are important. The first is that Russia says they've never heard of any kind of Ukraine peace plan. We have no idea what you're talking about. Again, this is 2 weeks ago. So this idea that Zelensky doesn't want peace, Zelensky, what do you mean he doesn't want peace? He held a peace conference 6 months ago, and then Russia themselves are like, dude, there's no plan. Allegedly, but this plan was allegedly proposed by the United States, but we don't know anything about it. And again, the TASS, this is Russia's official state media outlet, right, has said that Zelensky and the regime do not want peace. They literally repeat almost verbatim a Trump White House talking point. They refuse to settle the conflict through negotiations. This is just pure deflection. I don't know what else to call it, right? You can literally cite, I showed you a clear, to the date, peace conference that Russia was invited to and declined. And I've shown you statements by the Russian foreign minister that state we are not interested in a peace deal. So why then is it Zelensky who's not interested in peace? Why is Zelensky saying, listen, what we need is we can't get peace with Russia. We're never going to get it. Just like you say, listen, once your neighbor's broken in your house once, there's never going to be an agreement to get them to stay out of it. The only option available to you is to get the best locks and bars on your window possible. And that is the core of Zelensky's principles with this deal. He says, listen, I'm open to anything, but I have to be allowed to get the biggest, strongest locks strong enough that my dirtbag neighbor cannot break through them. That is it. So this is like utterly absurd. And it's one of the reasons the Europeans are treating this like it's insane. Now, we're going to talk about the state of the economy and the state of American public opinion. But first, I want to mention that today, we just dropped more uncensored combat footage from the front lines. We are going to see, this is from combatvetnews.com. You guys know that one of the reasons I am so critical of everyone on this channel is because I can be. Because you guys have my back, right? And combatvetnews.com is where you can support me. This functions just like Patreon. Every one of these tiers gets you twice a week uncensored combat footage. Oftentimes it's sent to me from frontline units that I met when I was over there. And it gives us the insights we can't get anywhere else into the state of combat in the front lines. So if you're interested in that stuff YouTube won't let me show you, the link is in the description. Okay. Now I want to check out two other things. The first is a CBS YouGov poll recently. And I know we can take polls with a grain of salt, but here's what I want to point out. This is 35 adults in the U.S. They surveyed a few thousand of them. And what they found, they surveyed, about 2,500 people. They asked, do you consider Russia an ally of the United States, friendly but not an ally, unfriendly, or an enemy of the United States? And again, on this channel, we have discussed ad nauseum that Russia has made it eminently clear their official state policy is that they are an adversary of the United States, that their ambitions are in direct conflict with the existence of a strong, prosperous United States. Okay? This is not a theory. This is something that Russia has explicitly said repeatedly and has taken actions to that effect. From hacking into U.S. infrastructure, stealing U.S. data, conducting massive influence operations. I know, don't even bother adding me about fucking the Trump-Russia thing. I know, but even if you take that and you pretend it never happened, you still have evidence of a massive Russian influence campaign around ultra-divisive issues, right? Ultra-divisive racial issues, ultra-divisive gun issues, and even some of the election fraud allegations are amplified by Russian outlets because, again, their goal is to sow massive distrust in the United States. So Russia is so actively hostile to the U.S., right? Remember, we talked about the fact that a Russian national, a Chechen, was mysteriously attacked. Not attacked. It was not in quotes. Attacked a U.S. Special Forces colonel in North Carolina. Luckily, a Special Forces colonel played no games, and it's the Chechen that emerged victorious, but it ruled a self-defense shooting, which meant that that individual, that Russian national, tried to take him out. So all these stories should tell you the exact kind of people who are running the Kremlin. And despite that, when you look at the people who identify as Republican, a combined 41% identify Putin and Russia as either an ally or friend, right? Which is insane. It is insane. It is unbelievable, right? And it is crazy to see, again, that even among Democrats, you still have up to 1 in 4 who believe Russia is a friend. They are not a friend. It is difficult to perceive, right? It is difficult to understand. And when you see actually education, at least among white survey respondents, they said they have probably still, you still see almost 1 in 5 or a little over 1 in 5 say that Russia might be an ally. This is absolutely insane, right? Particularly because when asked about Western Europe, Republicans overwhelmingly identify them as friends and allies, right? And this is pretty bizarre to sit there and go, well, we're friends with Russia, but we're definitely friends with the Western Europeans. And this is, I think, one of the things that's most interesting because it says how badly out of sync the Trump administration is. Because remember, the vice president's stance, and in fact, the president's own stance said in his little tweet or whatever the hell he calls it, he said, we better take care of the migrant problem or else we'll end up like Europe, right? How would you feel if your best friend was like, yo, I don't want to end up like Paul over there? You'd be like, hey, man, thought you were my friend. Do you see how these are the actions of not someone who is deeply responsive to the voter and the electorate? They're responding to something entirely different. Now, I wanted to cover 2 more stories. First off is that I've talked about the fact that this is just governance on another much worse level than we saw 10 years ago in the first Trump administration. And the reason it's so troubling is that, well, it's just being governed by chaos, right? We've noticed that things are extremely messy, that we just watched in real time as a petty slight decided major international policy. Trump himself said, you're playing with the lives of millions of people, and you decided that someone speaking in a second language offended you. Again, I didn't see anything that constituted an offensive statement, but even if you give Zelensky that, you would still are stuck with the fact that international policy is being decided by shit like whether or not he wore a fucking suit, which is dangerously stupid. And the markets are finally starting to catch up to this reality. You can see that when Trump was inaugurated, right, the market actually rallied. People thought they were going to have another pro-business president. But now they're realizing that instead we just have someone who is destructive, so destructive that there's actually growing arguments that he is someone who wants to take out the country, who wants to plunge America into to end the era of American dominance on the world stage. And the markets are starting to catch up because you notice here, since about February 19th, over the last 3 weeks or so, we've seen the market get absolutely crushed, going from a high of, this is the S&P 500, going from a high of 61,000. Now it's trading at a mere 57.48. And if you recall, 2008, right, which actually it won't even, let's see if we can zoom in here. You can see in 2008 that there was a gradual decline like this. And then after a couple months of that, boom, you saw the absolute collapse. And so this is the kind of thing that worries a lot of the market, right? And one other example here is, again, oh my God, what is this website? 11 Alive? Okay, well, fuck off. I need an actual news outlet that doesn't suck, right? I think it's the Atlanta Fed GDP number. There you go. Atlanta Fed GDP prediction. Okay. Here we go. Here's one that's, well, okay, it still sort of sucks. It's still 400 million pop-ups, but it's fine. The Atlanta Fed's GDP model is now predicting a massive decline, right? It will sink 2.8% under their current model, right, for the first quarter of this year, if trends continue, right? That is massive, guys, right? If you see GDP US over time, you're going to see, let's see if we can pull it up here. Here's the St. Louis Fed. This is the US. Oh, this is the total GDP. But if we can look at the GDP growth, you'll see that 2.8% is a massive blow to, here we go, World Bank open data, baby. Okay, here is the US GDP growth rate over the years. You could see that here is the zero line, and you could see there's only been a handful of years in which the U.S. economy shrunk. Remember the stagflation of the 70s? The oil crisis, right? That lost 0.5 and 0.2% of GDP, right? The 1980s, this major stock market crash, that wiped off 0.3% of GDP. And you could see the absolute disaster. Oh, this is the disastrous stock market crash of a huge recession, knocking out 1.8. And you can see over here, 2009, the absolute bottom of the Great Recession hit 2.6% of GDP was lost. And then in COVID, when we shut down the whole economy, we lost 2.2%. So what does that mean, guys? When the Fed says it's going to have a negative growth rate of worse than the Fed, worse than COVID, worse than the Great Recession. In fact, if you exclude these two, it's worse than any two recessions previous to that combined. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to at me, and you're going to go, listen, Paul, it's only because manufacturers are importing a lot of goods now to get ahead of the tariffs. But here's the question. If tariffs are so great for the economy and they're going to lower prices for consumers somehow, then why would manufacturers have to do this? What are they preparing for? And what's going to happen next month? If they've done all their importing this quarter, then what's going to happen next quarter? Oh, they're not going to have to import anything. So what are they going to have to do? Well, they're just going to have to use what they have. And what's that going to mean? That's going to mean that they're going to have to raise prices, but they're still not going to be able to offset consumer demand. So you can see that already things are starting to break and buckle in the economy, right? And this is not a minor problem. This is the problem. And a lot of people say, oh, well, geopolitics is geopolitics, and the Ukraine and Russia has nothing to do with this. That's not even remotely true, because Europe is one of the US's largest trading partners. And what happens if you're a US manufacturer and it costs you more to get products from China, and now it costs you more, thanks to retaliatory tariffs, to sell in Canada, Mexico, and Europe? Where else can you sell to? What other economies are going to buy your goods and services? Nothing. So you're going to see the worst of two worlds, a massive rise in inflation and a massive decline in the ability of U.S. companies to export their goods. And this is an absolute stagflation level disaster. And businesses are now expecting that to happen. Anyway, guys, stay safe out there. Hit the subscribe button. And of course, thanks to Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gaius Marnie, Eugenia Cuesta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Karius, L90, Petra Toruru, and all of our Lieutenant tier members. I will see you over on combatvetnews.com later today. Videos are dropping. I'm literally going to record them right now. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.